A quiet life. Nestled on the outskirts of a quiet town, Sarah Miller's home was an oasis of calm. Her modest bungalow, painted in soft cream with green shutters, was surrounded by a flourishing garden that seemed to explode with color year-round. To the townsfolk, Sarah was just the garden lady, a recluse whose days were spent cultivating roses, lilies, and vegetables in meticulous rows. She rarely ventured into town, and when she did, her soft-spoken demeanor and gentle smile left little impression. What few people knew was that Sarah had chosen this life of solitude deliberately. Her days started with the sunrise, coffee in hand as she inspected her garden with the precision of an artisan. Each flower was a masterpiece, each row of vegetables a testament to her patience and care. She had turned a once barren patch of land into a living, breathing paradise. Her neighbors occasionally waved from their porches, and she always waved back, but that was the extent of her interaction. No one visited unannounced. No one pried into her life. That was just how Sarah liked it. But this peace came with interruptions. Every few days, the stillness was shattered by the roar of motorcycles. The sound would start as a low rumble in the distance, growing louder until it reverberated through the narrow streets of her neighborhood. It was a local biker gang, the Iron Jackals, known for their loud, chaotic antics. They never lingered long, but their crude laughter, revving engines, and trail of trash always left a mark. Sarah had learned to ignore them, picking up discarded cans and cigarette butts without a word. It wasn't fear that silenced her. It was patience. She saw their actions as storms passing through, annoying but fleeting. However, even storms could cause damage if left unchecked. One crisp spring morning, as Sarah knelt among her tulips, she heard the now familiar sound of motorcycles approaching. She paused, trowel in hand, and watched as 5 riders roared down her street. Their bikes gleamed in the sunlight, and their leather jackets bore the Iron Jackal's insignia, a silver skull with jagged wings. This time, they didn't just pass by. The lead biker slowed, signaling the others to stop in front of her house. "Nice garden you got there, lady," the leader said, his voice loud enough to carry over the idle engines. He was tall, with a shaved head and a crooked grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Bet it takes you all day to make it look that pretty." Sarah didn't respond. She continued digging, her focus on the soil as though they weren't there. "Hey, we're talking to you," another biker shouted, flicking the cigarette butt into her flower bed. Sarah stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves. She turned her calm gaze to the group, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked evenly. The leader smirked. "Yeah, you can start by smiling. You're too serious for someone who plays with flowers all day." The others laughed, revving their engines for emphasis. Sarah remained silent, her gaze steady. After a moment, she bent down, picked up the cigarette butt, and dropped it into her pocket without a word. Her composure only seemed to irritate them further. "Cat got your tongue," one biker jeered, stepping off his bike. He kicked at the edge of her flower bed, scattering dirt onto the sidewalk. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice was calm when she spoke. "You've made your point. Now please leave." The leader's grin faltered. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to proceed. Then, with a shrug, he motioned to the others. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the flower lady to her weeds." As they roared away, Sarah stood in her garden, watching until the sound of their engines faded. She exhaled slowly, her hands resting on her hips. The soil they'd disturbed could be fixed. The flowers they'd trampled could be replanted. But their presence lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Sarah turned to her tool shed, her movements deliberate. She opened the door and stepped inside, letting her gaze sweep over the neatly arranged tools and supplies. On the far wall, hidden behind a row of gardening gloves, was a small, locked cabinet. Her hand hesitated for a moment before she reached into her pocket for the key. She unlocked the cabinet and opened it to reveal an array of items that seemed out of place in a gardener's shed. military-grade knives, tactical gear, and a well-maintained pistol. Sarah stared at the contents, her expression unreadable. It had been years since she'd needed any of it. Years since she'd left that life behind. But old habits died hard, and some skills were too ingrained to forget. She closed the cabinet and locked it again, her decision made. She wasn't looking for trouble, but if the iron jackals returned, she would be ready. A fractured peace. The days following the bikers' visit were quiet, but not in a comforting way. The stillness felt strained, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah returned to her usual routine, tending to her garden in the mornings and spending her afternoons reading on the porch. But the tranquility she had cultivated for years now seemed fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. She didn't dwell on their taunts or the dirt they had kicked into her flower beds. Those were minor inconveniences, easily fixed. What unsettled her was the memory of the leader's grin, the way his eyes had lingered on her property as though assessing its worth. People like that didn't just disappear. They came back. On the third day, Sarah's instincts proved correct. She was pruning a row of sunflowers when she heard the unmistakable rumble of engines. This time, the sound was louder, more deliberate. They weren't passing by. They were coming for her. She stood slowly, her gloved hands gripping the pruning shears. Through the gaps in her wooden fence, she saw them. 7 riders now, their motorcycles forming a menacing line along the curb. The leader, his shaved head gleaming in the sunlight, dismounted first. He pulled off his leather gloves with a theatrical flourish and approached the gate, his grin as cocky as ever. "Well, if it isn't the Garden Queen," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We thought we'd stop by and see how you're doing." Sarah removed her gloves and set them on the workbench. She didn't respond, her expression calm as she walked to the gate and stood behind it. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone neutral. The leader leaned against the gate, his fingers drumming lazily on the wood. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd pay a visit. Nice place you've got here. Must have taken a lot of work." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "It has. That's why I'd appreciate it if you stayed off my property." The leader laughed, the sound echoing across the quiet street. "Feisty, aren't you? I like that. But here's the thing. We don't take orders from some lady with dirt under her nails." His words drew laughter from the others, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she let her gaze drift past him, taking in the group's postures, their positioning. Years of training had taught her to read people, to assess threats in an instant. These men were overconfident, their swagger disguising a lack of real discipline. But overconfidence could be dangerous. "I'm asking you nicely," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Leave." The leader's grin faded slightly, replaced by a spark of annoyance. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he perceived as weak. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, the wooden gate the only barrier between them. "And what if we don't?" he asked, his tone low and threatening. Sarah held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Then you'll regret it." The words hung in the air, heavy with a certainty that made the leader hesitate. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for the gate, pushing it open with deliberate force. The other bikers followed, spreading out across her yard like wolves closing in on prey. Sarah stepped back, her movements calm and deliberate. She wasn't retreating. She was positioning herself. The leader gestured toward her flowers, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Pretty garden," he said. "Shame if something happened to it." Before Sarah could respond, one of the younger bikers kicked over a pot of lavender, scattering dirt and shards of ceramic across the grass. Another biker, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, grabbed a spade from her workbench and tossed it into the flower bed, uprooting a cluster of daisies. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Her calm demeanor only seemed to embolden them. The leader turned to her, his arms spread wide in mock innocence. "What's the matter, Garden Queen? Cat got your tongue." The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Sarah knew it was time to act. She couldn't let them destroy what she had built. Not her garden, and not her peace. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. The leader turned to her, his grin fading as he caught the steel in her gaze. "What did you say?" "I said enough," Sarah repeated, her tone unyielding. "You've had your fun. Now leave." For a moment, no one moved. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering under the weight of her calm defiance. The leader took a step closer, his hand resting on the handle of a knife strapped to his belt. "Or what?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. Her next words were quiet but laced with an unmistakable warning. "You don't want to find out." The leader stared at her, his confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. He didn't know why, but something about her unnerved him. She wasn't scared. She wasn't pleading. She was daring him. Before he could respond, Sarah moved. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a strength that belied her small frame. With a swift, practiced motion, she twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the knife. It hit the ground with a dull thud, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. The bikers froze, their shock palpable. Sarah released the leader's wrist and stepped back, her stance relaxed but ready. The leader clutched his arm, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," he spat. "Neither do you," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Now leave, before this gets worse." The bikers hesitated, their bravado replaced by uncertainty. They had come looking for an easy target, but they had found something else entirely. One by one, they retreated to their motorcycles, their movements awkward and disjointed. The leader was the last to go. He glared at Sarah, his eyes promising revenge. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. Sarah didn't respond. She watched as they mounted their bikes and roared away, the sound fading into the distance. Only when the street was silent again did she allow herself to breathe. She turned to her garden, her gaze sweeping over the damage. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was enough to remind her that her quiet life was no longer safe. She knelt among the scattered dirt and broken flowers, her hand steady as she began to repair the damage. The peace she had fought so hard to build had been fractured, but not destroyed. And Sarah Miller, the woman the world thought was just a quiet gardener, was ready for whatever came next. The shadows of the past. The air was still the morning after the confrontation. Sarah stood in her garden, her hands resting on the handle of her spade, surveying the damage the bikers had left behind. The scattered shards of a broken flower pot glinted in the sunlight, and her once pristine rows of lavender were trampled. Despite the wreckage, she worked methodically, repairing what she could and silently planning for what she couldn't replace. The leader's parting words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. It wasn't a threat she could ignore. Not anymore. After finishing her work in the garden, Sarah wiped her hands clean and headed toward her shed. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her as her gaze settled on the locked cabinet tucked into the corner. Taking the key from around her neck, she unlocked it with a steady hand. Inside lay the remnants of a life she'd hoped to leave behind. Tactical gear, a compact handgun, a survival knife, and a worn black case that once held a radio. Each item carried memories of a different version of herself, one that had no place in this quiet town. Sarah pulled out a small weathered notebook from the cabinet, her fingers brushing over the leather cover. She flipped it open to a page filled with names and numbers, most of them crossed out. Her gaze settled on one name that wasn't. Captain Alex Porter. Her thumb hovered over her phone's call button for a long moment. She didn't want to make the call. It would mean admitting that her past wasn't as distant as she tried to convince herself. But she knew she couldn't handle this alone. Not this time. The line clicked after the second ring. Porter, a deep voice answered. "Alex," Sarah said, her voice quieter than she intended. "It's me." There was a pause. "Sarah." The surprise in his tone was evident. "It's been, what, 5 years? I thought you wanted to stay off the radar." "I did," Sarah admitted. "But something's come up." Another pause. "What kind of something?" His voice grew serious, the tone of a man who had seen his share of trouble. "Trouble I didn't ask for," Sarah replied. She hesitated, then added, "A biker gang. They're harassing me and making threats." "Do they know who you are?" Alex asked sharply. "No, they think I'm just some gardener. But they've been here twice now, and they're not going to stop." There was a brief silence. Then Alex spoke. "You know what to do, Sarah. You've handled worse." "I know," she said. "But I thought you should know. Just in case. In case it goes sideways." Alex asked. "In case they push me too far," Sarah corrected. Her voice was steady, but her words carried an edge that didn't go unnoticed. Alex sighed. "I'll make some calls. See if we can dig up anything on these guys. In the meantime, be careful. You've been out of the game for a while." "Not so long that I've forgotten how to handle myself," Sarah said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm sure you haven't," Alex said. "But still, call me if it escalates." "I will," Sarah promised before ending the call. She placed the phone down and stared at the open cabinet. For years, she had avoided this part of herself, burying it beneath the quiet life she'd built. But now, the lines between her past and present were beginning to blur. She closed the cabinet, locking it securely, and turned her attention back to the garden. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Sarah knew better than to let her guard down. The bikers were quiet, but their absence only heightened her sense of unease. She spent her mornings working in the garden as usual, but now her movements were deliberate and watchful. She noted every sound, every unfamiliar face passing through the neighborhood. It was late one evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the hills, that Sarah's instincts were proven right. She was sitting on her porch, sipping tea and enjoying the cool breeze, when the faint rumble of motorcycles reached her ears. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. They were coming back. Sarah set her cup down and stood, her heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She stepped inside her house and moved quickly to the shed, grabbing a flashlight and slipping her hand into the pocket where she now kept her pistol. She didn't plan to use it, but she wasn't about to face them unarmed. When she stepped back outside, the motorcycles were pulling up to her property. This time, there were more of them. 10, maybe 12. They parked in a chaotic line along the curb, their engines growling like restless beasts. The leader dismounted first, his movements sharp and deliberate. His shaved head caught the moonlight, and his grin was colder than before. "Evening, Garden Queen," he called, his voice loud and mocking. "Did you miss us?" The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing in the quiet street. Sarah didn't respond. She stood on her porch, her flashlight pointed at the ground, and watched as they fanned out, their boots crunching on the gravel of her driveway. The leader stopped at the base of the porch steps, his grin widening as he took in her calm demeanor. "What's the matter? Not happy to see us?" "You need to leave," Sarah said, her voice steady. "And what if we don't?" he asked, his tone taunting. "What's a little gardener like you gonna do about it?" Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "You don't want to find out." The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." He turned to his crew, motioning for them to spread out. "Let's show her what happens when someone doesn't respect the jackals." The bikers moved toward her garden, kicking over pots and tearing at the flowers. Sarah felt a pang of anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't about the garden anymore. This was about control, about sending a message. And Sarah had no intention of letting them win. She stepped off the porch, her movements deliberate. The leader turned to watch her, his grin faltering slightly as she approached. "That's enough," Sarah said, her voice firm. The leader smirked. "Or what?" Sarah's response was quiet but chilling. "Or you'll regret it." Before he could react, Sarah moved. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip. In one fluid motion, she twisted, forcing him to his knees. The bikers froze, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched their leader writhe in pain. Sarah leaned in close, her voice low and deadly. "I'm not just a gardener." She released him abruptly, and he fell to the ground, clutching his wrist and glaring up at her with a mixture of fury and fear. The other bikers hesitated, their bravado cracking under the weight of her calm defiance. "Leave," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And don't come back." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their confidence shattered. The leader was the last to go, his gaze burning with unspoken threats as he mounted his bike. "This isn't over," he spat before revving his engine and speeding away. Sarah watched them disappear into the night, her expression unreadable. Only when the street was silent again did she turn back to her house. She paused on the porch, her gaze sweeping over the damaged garden, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It wasn't over, but neither was she. Gathering storm. The town seemed to hold its breath in the days after the bikers' latest retreat. Sarah could feel the tension lingering in the air like a storm on the horizon. The garden, her sanctuary for years, now felt exposed, a battleground rather than a refuge. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant rumble of engines, set her on edge. She spent her mornings repairing the damage to her garden, each careful stroke of her trowel a silent act of defiance. Her flowers would bloom again, her vegetables would flourish, but as much as she tried to focus on the soil and the sunlight, her mind kept returning to the bikers, their mocking laughter, the leader's venomous promise. "This isn't over." Sarah knew it wasn't idle talk. Men like him didn't back down. They regrouped, rearmed, and retaliated. That evening, Sarah made a decision. The quiet life she had built couldn't survive in isolation anymore. She needed to prepare, not just for herself, but for the town she had come to call home. The iron jackals were a threat to everyone, not just her. She retrieved her phone and scrolled through the list of contacts, her thumb hovering over Alex Porter's name. She hesitated, then tapped the screen. The line connected after a single ring. "Sarah." Alex's voice was clipped, tense. "What's the situation?" "They came back," Sarah said simply. Alex exhaled sharply. "How bad?" "They brought more men this time," she replied. "But they left, for now." "That's not good," Alex said. "They're testing you, figuring out how far they can push." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I need information. Everything you can find on the Iron Jackals. Their leadership, their operations, their weaknesses." There was a pause. "You're not thinking of going after them alone, are you?" "I'm not planning a war," Sarah said, though the determination in her voice hinted otherwise. "I just need to be ready." Alex sighed. "All right. I'll see what I can dig up. But Sarah, be careful. These guys aren't amateurs." "Neither am I," she replied. After ending the call, Sarah stood in her shed, her eyes scanning the tools and supplies she had gathered over the years. Most of it was for gardening, but a few items stood out, reminders of a life she'd left behind. She reached for a weathered duffel bag in the corner and unzipped it, revealing the neatly packed contents: a lightweight tactical vest, a multi-tool, and a small but powerful flashlight. At the bottom of the bag was a sheaf of yellowed papers, maps marked with annotations and sketches. She pulled them out and spread them on her workbench, her fingers tracing the lines of roads and routes. The town was small, but it had its vulnerabilities: abandoned buildings, poorly lit streets, and a sparse police presence. The Iron Jackals had chosen their territory wisely. Sarah spent hours studying the maps, marking potential choke points and escape routes. Her military training resurfaced with startling clarity, each decision calculated, each possibility considered. By the time she was finished, the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Later that morning, Sarah paid a visit to the town's diner. The place was a hub of local gossip, and Sarah knew that if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual, it would be talked about over coffee and pie. She entered quietly, the bell above the door jangling as she stepped inside. The diner was modest, with red vinyl booths and a long counter where the regulars gathered. As Sarah approached the counter, a few heads turned, surprised to see her. She rarely ventured into town, and her presence immediately drew attention. "Morning, Sarah," said Ruth, the diner's owner, as she wiped down the counter. "What brings you here?" "Just passing through," Sarah replied, sliding onto a stool. She ordered a coffee and listened to the hum of conversation around her. It didn't take long to pick up the thread she was looking for. "Saw them out by the old mill last night," one man was saying to his companion. "The bikers looked like they were setting up for something. Probably another one of their parties," the other man replied. "Those guys don't do anything but drink and cause trouble." Sarah's ears perked up. The old mill was on the edge of town, a derelict building that had been abandoned for decades. It was secluded, far enough from prying eyes to make it the perfect hideout. She filed the information away and finished her coffee, leaving a generous tip before heading out. That afternoon, Sarah took a drive out to the old mill. She parked her car a safe distance away and approached on foot, keeping to the cover of the trees. As she drew closer, she could hear voices, gruff and loud, carrying on the wind. The bikers were there. From her vantage point, Sarah observed their camp. There were at least 15 of them, their motorcycles parked in a haphazard line. A bonfire crackled in the center of the clearing, and a few makeshift tents were pitched nearby. The leader, she remembered hearing someone call him Grayson, stood apart from the group, his arms crossed as he spoke to a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked just as dangerous. Sarah stayed hidden, watching their movements and listening to snippets of their conversation. She noted the weapons they carried: knives, chains, and a few handguns tucked into holsters. These men weren't just a nuisance. They were organized, prepared for violence. As the sun began to set, Sarah retreated back to her car. She had seen enough to confirm what she already suspected. The iron jackals weren't going to stop until someone forced them to. That evening, Sarah called Alex again. "They're camped out at the old mill," she said. 15, maybe more. "They're armed." Alex cursed under his breath. "That's worse than I thought. You need to stay away from them, Sarah. Let the authorities handle it." "There's no time," Sarah said. "You know how long it takes for anything to happen in a town like this." "Then wait for me," Alex said. "I'll come down myself if I have to." "I can handle it," Sarah replied. "But I'll call if I need backup." Alex hesitated, then sighed. "Just be smart, Sarah." "I always am," she said, ending the call. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the maps spread out on her table. The old mill was the perfect place for the iron jackals to regroup, but it was also their greatest weakness. Isolated and poorly defended, it wouldn't take much to disrupt their operations. The question was how far Sarah was willing to go to protect the life she had built. The answer came easily: as far as it takes. The quiet fury. The following night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the ears and sharpens the senses. Sarah sat in her living room, the maps of the old mill spread across the table before her. Next to them lay her tools: a pair of bolt cutters, a small but powerful flashlight, a crowbar, and her pistol, freshly cleaned and loaded. This wasn't a decision she'd made lightly. For years, Sarah had avoided situations like this, preferring the quiet life she had carved out of the chaos of her past. But the iron jackals had made it clear they wouldn't stop until someone stood in their way. If no one else would, it had to be her. Sarah parked her car a mile away from the old mill, ensuring it was out of sight. She walked the rest of the way under the cover of darkness, her movements silent and deliberate. The duffel bag over her shoulder felt light despite its contents, a testament to the years of muscle memory that still lingered in her body. As she approached the mill, the sounds of the iron jackals grew louder. Laughter, shouting, the clinking of bottles. The bonfire she had seen earlier burned even brighter now, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the crumbling structure. Sarah crouched behind a cluster of bushes, taking in the scene. The bikers were scattered, most of them clustered around the fire. Grayson, the leader, stood near one of the old storage sheds, talking animatedly with a group of men. A few others patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the darkness in slow, sweeping arcs. They were sloppy, overconfident. Sarah had seen it before, men who thought their numbers made them invincible. They were wrong. The first step was cutting the chain on the side gate. Sarah moved quickly, her bolt cutters slicing through the rusted links with ease. She pushed the gate open just enough to slip inside, her footsteps silent on the gravel. She had memorized the layout of the mill from the maps, and she moved with precision, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the light from the bonfire. Her target wasn't the bikers themselves, not yet. First, she needed to disrupt their operations. The old generator that powered their lights and equipment sat near the back of the mill. It was a clunky, outdated machine, barely functional even at a glance. Sarah crouched next to it, her hands moving deftly as she loosened bolts and severed wires. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the area into near darkness. The bikers' voices rose in confusion. Flashlights flickered to life as they tried to figure out what had happened. Sarah used the commotion to slip further into the mill, her next target clear in her mind. Their stash. The storage shed near the bonfire housed crates of supplies, tools, alcohol, and most importantly, weapons. Sarah had seen Grayson and his men unloading them earlier. If she could destroy or disable their arsenal, it would leave them vulnerable and less inclined to retaliate. She reached the shed without incident, the noise from the bikers covering the sound of her movements. The door was padlocked, but Sarah had come prepared. She slipped a lock-picking kit from her pocket and got to work, the familiar motions coming easily. Within seconds, the lock clicked open, and she slipped inside. The shed reeked of oil and metal. Crates were stacked haphazardly, some spilling open to reveal handguns, knives, and ammunition. Sarah worked quickly, removing firing pins, slashing straps, and pouring sand into fuel containers. It wasn't enough to completely destroy the weapons, but it would render them useless until someone with the right skills could repair them. She was almost finished when the door slammed open. A beam of light blinded her momentarily, and she froze. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a patchy beard, stood in the doorway, his flashlight trained on her. "Hey," he shouted. "What the hell?" Sarah moved before he could finish. She lunged forward, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The flashlight fell from his hand, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. He stumbled back, his other hand reaching for a knife at his belt, but Sarah didn't give him the chance. She drove her knee into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him, and then delivered a quick, precise blow to the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Sarah dragged him into the shed, tying his hands and feet with zip ties she'd brought for this purpose. She shoved him into the corner, out of sight, and stepped back outside, her senses on high alert. The commotion had drawn attention. She could hear voices shouting over the crackle of the bonfire, flashlights sweeping the area more erratically now. Grayson's voice cut through the chaos, barking orders. "Find whoever did this. Now." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. She had expected this. Moving swiftly, she retreated to the edge of the property, keeping low and out of sight. Her goal wasn't to eliminate the bikers, not tonight. It was to send a message. Sarah reached her final target, their motorcycles. They were parked in a neat line near the front gate, gleaming in the moonlight. The bikes were their pride, their lifeline. Without them, the iron jackals would be stranded and humiliated. She worked quickly, slashing tires and cutting fuel lines. The smell of gasoline filled the air as she drained the tanks, the liquid pooling beneath the bikes. For a moment, she considered setting them alight, but she decided against it. The flames would draw too much attention, and she wasn't here to cause unnecessary destruction. By the time she was finished, the bikers were still searching the mill, their flashlights darting across the grounds like frantic fireflies. Sarah slipped through the side gate and disappeared into the darkness, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. Back in her car, Sarah drove away from the mill, her hands steady on the wheel. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following her, but the road behind her was empty. She had sent a message tonight, not just to the iron jackals, but to herself. The quiet life she had built might have been shaken, but she wasn't powerless. She wasn't just a gardener. She was a fighter, a survivor. As the town lights came into view, Sarah allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The bikers thought they could intimidate her, but they had underestimated her. And that was their first mistake. It wouldn't be their last. Striking back. As Sarah drove back into town, her mind raced through the events of the night. The bikers' operations were disrupted, their weapons rendered useless, and their motorcycles sabotaged. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The iron jackals wouldn't simply shrug this off. They'd be enraged, unpredictable, and even more dangerous. Sarah parked her car in the garage, closing the door behind her with a deliberate click. She took a moment to sit in the darkness, steadying her breath. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind a sharp clarity. She'd struck the first blow, but the next move would be theirs. The next morning, the news of chaos at the old mill spread like wildfire. At the diner, patrons whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what might have happened. "Did you hear?" Ruth said, pouring coffee for a regular. "Something happened at the old mill last night. The bikers were tearing through town this morning, looking furious." "What do you think caused it?" Another patron asked, his tone nervous. "I heard some of their bikes got wrecked." "Good," Ruth muttered. About time someone stood up to them. Sarah sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable, but inside, her mind was calculating. The iron jackal's reaction was predictable. They'd come storming into town, looking for answers, and seeking to reclaim their dominance. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah prepared. She walked through her garden, checking every gate and path. Her toolshed was locked, and her weapons were stashed in strategic locations around the house. She didn't want to fight, but if it came to that, she wouldn't hesitate. She had just finished double-checking her preparations when she heard it. The faint rumble of engines in the distance. Her pulse quickened. They were coming. The roar of motorcycles grew louder, echoing through the quiet streets. Sarah stood on her porch, her flashlight in one hand and her pistol concealed in her waistband. The iron jackals appeared moments later, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they screeched to a halt in front of her property. Grayson dismounted first, his face a mask of fury. Behind him, his men fanned out, their movements less confident than before. The events at the mill had shaken them, but their loyalty to their leader and their need to save face kept them in line. Grayson approached the gate, his steps heavy with anger. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he snarled. Sarah didn't respond. She stood still, her gaze steady as she watched him approach. "You think you can mess with us and get away with it," he continued, his voice rising. "You don't know who you're dealing with, lady." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Sarah said calmly. "A group of bullies who think they own this town." Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. "Bullies, huh? We'll see who's the bully when this is over." He turned to his men, barking orders. "Tear this place apart." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other. The memory of what had happened at the mill lingered in their minds, casting doubt over their bravado. Grayson noticed their hesitation and scowled. "Do it," he shouted. One of the bikers stepped forward, his hand reaching for the latch on the gate. That's when Sarah moved. In a single fluid motion, she raised her flashlight and pointed it directly at his face, the beam blinding him. He stumbled back, swearing loudly. "Step any closer," Sarah said, her voice steady, "and you'll regret it." Grayson laughed, though the sound was forced. "You think you can scare us with a flashlight?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she stepped off the porch, her movements deliberate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a remote detonator. The sight of it made Grayson's smirk falter. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. Sarah's gaze never left his. "You wanted a fight," she said. "Now you've got one." She pressed the button. A series of loud pops erupted from the yard as small smoke charges she had planted earlier went off. The air filled with thick, choking clouds, obscuring the bikers' vision. They shouted in confusion, stumbling back as the smoke enveloped them. Sarah moved quickly, using the chaos to her advantage. She ducked into the shadows, her movements silent and precise. She had no intention of engaging them directly. Not yet. Her goal was to disorient and scatter them. One of the bikers, coughing and swearing, stumbled toward the gate. Sarah stepped out from behind a tree, her flashlight trained on him. Before he could react, she swung the flashlight in a wide arc, striking him across the temple. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Grayson's voice cut through the chaos. "Get it together. Find her." Sarah moved again, staying one step ahead of the disoriented bikers. She used the terrain to her advantage, leading them away from the house and into the garden. The paths, winding and uneven, slowed them down, and the dense vegetation provided ample cover. One by one, she took them out, tripping them with wires she had strung across the paths, striking them with precision when they were vulnerable. It wasn't long before their numbers dwindled, their confidence shattered. Grayson was the last to fall. Sarah cornered him near the tool shed, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He pulled a knife from his belt, brandishing it with shaking hands. "Stay back," he shouted. Sarah stepped closer, her expression calm. "It's over, Grayson. Call off your men." His eyes darted around, searching for backup, but there was none. His crew was either unconscious or fleeing, leaving him alone. With a roar of desperation, he lunged at her. Sarah sidestepped easily, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife fell to the ground, and Grayson let out a pained cry as she forced him to his knees. "You think you can stop us?" he spat. "There'll be more of us. We'll come back." Sarah leaned in close, her voice low and cold. "Not if they find out what happened to you tonight. Go back to your people. Tell them what happened here. And make sure they understand. This town isn't theirs to take." She released him and stepped back, her gaze unyielding. Grayson scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist as he stumbled toward his motorcycle. He didn't look back as he roared away, leaving his men and his pride behind. As the night settled into silence, Sarah stood in the middle of her garden, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The iron jackals were broken, their power diminished. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. It never was. She turned to her house, her steps deliberate as she walked up the porch. Tomorrow, she would fix the damage and tend to her garden, just as she always did. But tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The quiet life she had built wasn't as fragile as it seemed, and Sarah Miller, the woman they had underestimated, was far from defenseless. The echoes of resolve. The iron jackals didn't return the next morning, or the day after that. The town, unaware of the confrontation that had unfolded on Sarah's property, continued its quiet rhythm. But Sarah felt the weight of the events lingering in the air, like the last echoes of a thunderstorm. She stood in her garden as the early sunlight filtered through the trees, her hands brushing against the leaves of her lavender plants. Despite the damage, the garden still stood, vibrant and alive. It was a symbol of resilience, much like its caretaker. The aftermath. By mid-morning, Sarah noticed movement on her street. A police cruiser rolled by slowly, its windows down. The officer inside, a young man named Officer Whittaker, waved as he passed. Sarah waved back, her expression calm, but her thoughts racing. Word of the bikers' retreat must have reached the authorities. Whether they suspected her involvement or not, she wasn't sure. Whittaker pulled to a stop a few houses down and stepped out, walking toward her. "Morning, Ms. Miller," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I have a word?" "Of course," Sarah said, setting down her gardening shears. Whittaker glanced around, his posture uneasy. "There've been reports about the iron jackals causing trouble at the old mill, and, well, folks say they've been prowling around this neighborhood too. You seen anything unusual?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "I heard motorcycles a couple of nights ago," she said honestly, "but they didn't stay long." Whittaker nodded, his gaze drifting to the faint tire marks still visible on her driveway. "If they bother you, don't hesitate to call. We're keeping an eye on them." "I appreciate that," Sarah said with a small smile. "I'll let you know if I see anything." As Whittaker returned to his cruiser, Sarah watched him drive away, her mind already working. The jackals might have been scattered, but Grayson's parting words echoed in her memory. "There'll be more of us." Sarah knew that the iron jackals wouldn't let their defeat go unanswered. Their pride, their reputation, demanded retaliation. But pride was a weakness, and Sarah had every intention of exploiting it. The rebuild. Over the next few days, Sarah focused on her garden. The act of restoring what had been damaged was both practical and symbolic. With each pot replaced, each flower replanted, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her neighbors, unaware of the true extent of her recent ordeal, stopped by to admire her work. "Your garden looks even better than before," Mrs. Dunham, an elderly widow from 2 houses down, said one afternoon. "I don't know how you do it." "Patience," Sarah replied with a smile. "And a little bit of resilience." Mrs. Dunham chuckled, patting Sarah's arm. "Well, whatever it is, it's working. This town could use more people like you." Sarah's smile lingered long after Mrs. Dunham left. The compliment reminded her why she had chosen this life, why she had worked so hard to keep her past buried. She wasn't a soldier anymore, or a strategist. She was simply a woman trying to cultivate something beautiful in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. An unexpected visit. One evening, as Sarah was settling down with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed. The screen displayed a name she hadn't seen in years, Captain Alex Porter. She answered quickly. "Alex." "I've got news," Alex said without preamble. "The Iron Jackals are regrouping. Grayson's been talking to some bigger players, trying to pull in reinforcements." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "How many?" "Enough to be a problem," Alex replied. "They're planning to hit your town hard. They want to send a message." Sarah's jaw clenched. She had expected retaliation, but not on this scale. "How long do I have?" "A week, maybe less," Alex said. "I can get a team down there. Help even the odds." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This isn't your fight. I can handle it." "Sarah." "I mean it, Alex," she interrupted. "This town is my home. If they come back, I'll stop them. Just keep me informed." There was a long pause before Alex sighed. "All right. But you call me if things go sideways. Promise me that." "I promise," Sarah said. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence for a long moment. Then, with deliberate movements, she stood and walked to the shed. The cabinet where she kept her old gear stood open now, its contents neatly arranged. She reached inside, her fingers brushing over the tactical vest, the flashlight, the survival knife. This time, she wasn't preparing for defense. She was preparing for war. The final preparation. Sarah spent the next few days fortifying her property. She installed motion sensors along the perimeter of her garden, their range overlapping to ensure there were no blind spots. Tripwires rigged to small smoke charges were hidden among the flower beds, and she set up a series of concealed cameras to monitor every angle. Her neighbors noticed her increased activity but said nothing, assuming she was simply engrossed in her gardening. If they suspected anything, they kept it to themselves. By the time the iron jackals returned, Sarah was ready. The second confrontation. It was just past midnight when the motion sensors triggered, their silent alerts flashing on Sarah's phone. She rose from her bed, already dressed in dark clothing, and slipped on her tactical vest. The cameras confirmed what she had expected, a convoy of motorcycles approaching from the main road. This time, there were more of them. At least 20 riders, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Grayson led the charge, his posture tense, and his face a mask of determination. Sarah watched them from the safety of her porch, her pistol holstered at her side. As they roared into view, she activated the first stage of her plan. The motion sensors triggered a series of floodlights, bathing her property in harsh white light. The bikers skidded to a halt, their eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. Grayson dismounted, his fists clenched as he shouted over the noise. "Turn those damn lights off." Sarah stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the garden. "You came all this way for a light show," she called, her voice calm but carrying across the distance. "I expected more." Grayson's face twisted with rage. "You think this is funny? You think you've won? I think you've made a mistake," Sarah replied. "You're not leaving here the same way you came." Grayson's men exchanged uneasy glances, but he ignored them, drawing a knife from his belt. "You don't scare me, lady." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," she said. "Fear makes people sloppy." With that, she activated the next stage. Smoke charges erupted along the garden's edge, the thick clouds disorienting the bikers. Amid the chaos, Sarah moved, her years of training guiding her every step. One by one, the bikers fell to her traps, tripwires, blinding lights, and sudden bursts of sound. Those who managed to avoid the traps found themselves facing Sarah directly. She moved like a shadow, precise and unrelenting, her strikes disabling them before they could react. Grayson was the last to fall. When he lunged at her, knife in hand, she sidestepped easily, her movements fluid. With a single, practiced motion, she disarmed him and forced him to the ground. "You've lost," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady. "Leave now, and don't come back." Grayson glared up at her, his pride shattered. But he nodded, signaling his remaining men to retreat. As the bikers disappeared into the night, Sarah stood in her garden, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The fight was over, for now. But the strength she had reclaimed, the resolve she had rediscovered, would remain. This was her home, and no one would take it from her.